My grandfather's cabin was more than a rustic getaway. It was my childhood haven, the site of every lazy summer and every fishing trip where I caught more mosquitoes than fish. When Grandpa passed, he left it to me, along with a letter. Take care of it. They'll try to take it from you. At first, I thought he was being dramatic. Who's they? Ghosts? Bears? Then I met the HOA. I didn't even live in the cabin full-time. I had a house in the suburbs and worked remotely. The cabin was my escape. A 900-square-foot slice of heaven on a sprawling piece of land that smelled of pine and freedom. It wasn't even part of the HOA. Grandpa had made sure of that. But apparently that didn't stop them. It started innocently enough with a letter on pastel stationery. Dear property owner, it read, in a font that screamed, we want your soul. We've noticed your property does not conform to the aesthetic guidelines of the Evergreen Estates HOA. Please contact us to discuss bringing it into compliance. I laughed. Then I filed it under trash. A week later, I found Marcy, the HOA president, on my land. Clipboard in hand, she was examining my porch like it owed her money. She had the air of someone who believed she could cite the birds for chirping too loudly. Excuse me, I said, approaching her. Can I help you? She looked at me, startled, then recovered with a smile so fake I could practically see the plastic melting in the summer heat. Oh, I was just admiring the property. Great. Admire it from the road. Her smile twitched. This cabin is quite unique, but it doesn't align with our community standards. That's because it's not part of your community. Well, she said, tapping her clipboard, that's precisely the issue. Evergreen Estates has been expanding its boundaries, and this property falls within our purview now. Purview? I echoed, incredulous. This isn't SimCity. You can't just annex land. She gave a condescending chuckle. We can discuss it at the next HOA meeting. I've already noted several violations. I cut her off. You can't enforce rules on a property that isn't in your jurisdiction. Her eyes narrowed. We'll see about that. The next week was like something out of a sitcom. Marcy and her clipboard cronies kept appearing on my land, taking pictures, muttering about non-standard roofing materials and unapproved structures. My mailbox was flooded with letters demanding fines for violations I hadn't committed. One even suggested that my outhouse, which hadn't been functional in decades, was an environmental hazard. I wasn't about to let some HOA overlord steamroll me or my grandfather's legacy. So I did what any self-respecting millennial would do. I researched, and I discovered two things. First, the HOA's claims were as shaky as a Jenga tower. My property was explicitly excluded from their charter, and no amount of Marcy's scribbles could change that. Second, Marcy had a reputation. A little digging in public records and a few chats with longtime residents revealed she was a control freak with a penchant for overreach. She'd once tried to fine a retiree for planting tulips instead of roses. Another time, she'd called the cops on a kid's lemonade stand, claiming it violated zoning laws. It was time to fight fire with fire. I wasn't alone in this battle for long. My first ally was Carl, my neighbor down the road. Carl was a retired lawyer with a fondness for fishing and a deep-seated hatred for HOAs. He'd been tangling with them for years over his unapproved boat dock. When I told him about Marcy, he grinned like a kid with a slingshot. She's barking up the wrong tree. Let's take her down a peg. Then there was Diane, the owner of the local bait shop and a lifelong friend of my grandfather. She had a sharp tongue, a louder voice, and a network of loyal customers who'd been harassed by the HOA. When I mentioned my situation, she said, "You need a posse. Let me make some calls." Before long, I had an army of retirees, fishermen, and frustrated homeowners ready to back me up. Together, we started documenting everything. Photos of Marcy trespassing, screenshots of her absurd letters, and recordings of her condescending lectures. Carl suggested we hit them where it hurt. Legally. They're banking on you not knowing your rights, he said. We'll prove them wrong. I filed a cease and desist order to stop Marcy and her clipboard crew from stepping foot on my land. Diane organized a community meeting where dozens of residents shared their HOA horror stories, and I started digging deeper into the HOA's finances. If they were this aggressive with me, who knew what else they were up to? As it turned out, a lot. Marcy had been using HOA funds to pay for consulting fees that just happened to go to her cousin's landscaping company. She'd also been charging exorbitant fines and pocketing a suspicious percentage for administrative costs. The more we uncovered, the clearer it became. Marcy wasn't just overstepping. She was corrupt. As I prepared to take the next step, filing a lawsuit, I got an unexpected surprise. A notice taped to my cabin door. It was a demolition order, signed by Marcy herself, claiming my property was unfit for habitation. That's when I knew this wasn't just about a power trip. Marcy wanted my cabin gone, and she was willing to break every rule to make it happen. Little did she know, I wasn't just fighting to save my cabin. I was fighting to bring her whole operation crashing down. The demolition notice was the last straw. It wasn't just a power move. It was a declaration of war. Marcy and her clipboard mafia had gone from annoying to outright dangerous. I took a picture of the notice and sent it to Carl. "What do you think?" I asked him. "I think Marcy's got a death wish," he replied, his voice crackling through the phone. "This isn't just trespassing or harassment anymore. She's committing fraud. Let's make her regret it." Carl filed an immediate injunction to block the demolition order, citing everything from lack of jurisdiction to fraudulent misrepresentation. While the legal paperwork worked its magic, I doubled down on the grassroots efforts. Diane's community meeting had snowballed into a full-blown rebellion. People were eager to share their stories about Marcy and the HOA. One woman said Marcy fined her $500 for excessive foliage because she had a bird feeder in her yard. Another guy revealed that Marcy had tried to tow his truck for being unsightly, even though it was parked in his own driveway. But the real bombshell came from a guy named Frank who used to be on the HOA board. Frank was a soft-spoken man who carried around a folder thicker than a New York deli sandwich. "I quit after 6 months," he said at the meeting, handing me the folder. "Marcy's been cooking the books for years. I tried to report it, but she buried me in lawsuits until I gave up." Inside the folder were financial records, meeting transcripts, and email printouts that painted a damning picture. Marcy had been using HOA funds to line her pockets, fund her cousin's sketchy landscaping business, and even pay for a luxury vacation to Cancun, under the guise of a community outreach retreat. With Frank's folder and the testimonies from other residents, I had everything I needed to turn this into a full-scale exposé. Diane, ever the loudspeaker, suggested we go public. "Let's make this a spectacle," she said, her eyes gleaming. "If Marcy wants a fight, we'll give her one she can't ignore." We started small, sharing stories on social media. I posted the demolition order, the trespassing photos, and some of Frank's juiciest findings. The posts went viral in the local community, and soon the local news station picked up the story. They sent a reporter to interview me, and I made sure to emphasize how Marcy was targeting a grieving grandson trying to protect his late grandfather's legacy. If Marcy had hoped to intimidate me, she'd seriously miscalculated. Of course, Marcy didn't back down. A few days later, I woke up to the sound of heavy machinery. I looked out the window and saw a bulldozer parked at the edge of my property, flanked by 2 HOA lackeys in polo shirts. I stormed outside, phone in hand, recording every step. "What the hell is going on?" I shouted. One of the lackeys, a guy with the charisma of wet cardboard, stepped forward. "We're here to execute the demolition order." I laughed, though it was more out of disbelief than humor. "You mean the demolition order that's already been blocked by a court injunction?" His face turned red. We weren't informed of that." "Well, consider yourself informed," I said, shoving the injunction papers in his face. "And unless you want a lawsuit for unlawful destruction of private property, I suggest you get your bulldozer off my land. Now." Marcy herself wasn't there, of course. She wasn't the type to get her hands dirty, but I could feel her presence like an evil spirit hovering over the scene. I made sure to pan my phone across the bulldozer, the lackeys, and the property line markers showing they had no business being there. The lackeys muttered something about just following orders and slunk away, taking the bulldozer with them. That little stunt was all I needed to solidify my case. With the video footage of the bulldozer incident, the financial records from Frank, and the growing pile of testimonies from other residents, I contacted a lawyer who specialized in HOA disputes. Carl helped me draft a lawsuit against the HOA for harassment, fraud, and abuse of power. But we didn't stop there. Diane's network of residents organized a petition to remove Marcy from her position as HOA president. We collected signatures, plastered them across social media, and even held a rally outside the HOA office. Diane brought donuts and coffee. I brought a megaphone. When the local news station showed up to cover the rally, I knew we had Marcy cornered. It wasn't just about my cabin anymore. It was about exposing the rotten core of the HOA and holding Marcy accountable for years of unchecked power. The pressure finally got to Marcy. A week after the rally, she resigned as HOA president, citing personal reasons. But it wasn't over for her, not by a long shot. The lawsuit I'd filed was still moving forward, and the HOA was facing an audit thanks to the financial records we'd uncovered. As for my cabin, in addition to the fact that the court has already officially declared the demolition order invalid, the judge even issued a warning to the condominium to stay away from my property or face serious legal consequences. I celebrated by inviting Diane, Carl, and the rest of the rebellion over for a barbecue at the cabin. We laughed, swapped stories, and toasted to Grandpa, who would have loved seeing the clipboard army get their comeuppance. But, just the next morning, my phone buzzed with a message from Diana. "You're not gonna believe this," it read. Attached was a photo of a new notice from the HOA. This time, it wasn't about my cabin, it was about Diane's bait shop. I sighed and smiled. Looks like Marcy's clipboard army isn't done yet. If I'd learned anything from my battle with Marcy and her clipboard brigade, it was this: HOAs are like cockroaches. Just when you think you've squashed them, another one crawls out from under the fridge. Diane's bait shop notice was proof of that. The letter was as absurd as it was infuriating. It claimed her shop violated commercial appearance guidelines and demanded she repaint the building in approved neutral tones. Diane's shop was a staple in town. A cheerful blue building with a hand-painted sign, weathered just enough to have character. Changing it would be like slapping beige paint on a classic car. Diane wasn't one to roll over, and she definitely wasn't painting her shop beige. "Let them try," she said, tossing the letter into the fireplace. "If they want to fight, I'll give them one." Still, it was clear the HOA hadn't learned their lesson. Even with Marcy gone, her cronies were still clinging to their misguided sense of power. And now, they'd made the mistake of targeting one of my allies. "Let's hit them where it hurts," I told Diane. Again, Carl and I dove back into research mode. The new HOA president was a man named Greg, one of Marcy's staunchest supporters. He had the personality of a filing cabinet and a track record of rubber-stamping Marcy's every decision. If Greg thought Diane's bait shop was his next power play, he was about to find out that the clipboard mafia had lost its teeth. We started by reviewing the HOA's bylaws again. Diane's bait shop wasn't even part of the Evergreen Estates HOA. It was outside their jurisdiction, just like my cabin. The notice was as baseless as Marcy's demolition order, and we were ready to prove it. But then we stumbled onto something even better. While combing through public records, Carl found discrepancies in how Greg had been elected president. Turns out, Greg had skipped a few required steps, like notifying residents of the election or holding a formal vote. He'd essentially declared himself president after Marcy's resignation, which made his position not just unethical but outright illegal. Armed with this new information, we decided to make our move. Diane hosted another community meeting at her shop, and this time we went straight for the HOA's jugular. Carl presented the evidence of Greg's sham election, while I played a greatest hits reel of the HOA's recent overreaches, including their failed attempt to bulldoze my cabin. The meeting ended with a unanimous vote. The residents wanted the HOA board dissolved and Greg removed from his position. But we weren't stopping there. Diane and I led a small group to file a formal complaint with the state's Department of Consumer Affairs, which oversees HOAs. "This isn't just mismanagement," Carl said as we filled out the forms. "This is abuse of power, plain and simple." The state's investigation moved faster than we expected. Within weeks, Greg was ousted as HOA president, and the board was suspended pending a full audit. Meanwhile, Diane's bait shop notice was officially rescinded, along with several other bogus fines and citations the HOA had issued in recent time. The fallout was glorious. Residents who'd been harassed for years finally came forward with their own stories, creating a tidal wave of complaints that made it impossible for the HOA to continue operating in its current form. By the time the audit was complete, the state declared Evergreen Estates HOA defunct. With the HOA dismantled, life returned to normal, or as normal as it could get in a town that had just overthrown a miniature dictatorship. Diane's bait shop thrived, its blue paint a proud symbol of victory. My cabin remained untouched, and I finally had the peace to restore it the way Grandpa would have wanted. But the best part? Watching Greg and his clipboard cronies squirm. With Marcy's corruption exposed and the HOA gone, they'd lost their power and credibility. The town rallied together to make sure nothing like this would happen again, forming a new, resident-run council that focused on community improvement rather than petty power trips. One evening, as I was sipping a beer on my cabin porch, Carl pulled up in his old pickup truck. He got out holding an envelope. "This came for you," he said, handing it over. "Figured you'd want to see it." Inside was a letter from Marcy. Not a pastel notice or a fake citation, but an actual, handwritten note. "I hope you're satisfied," it began, the bitterness practically dripping off the page. "You've destroyed everything I worked for. But don't think this is over. People like me don't just disappear." I laughed and tossed the letter onto the fire pit. Marcy might not disappear, but neither would I. If she ever tried to come back, I'd be ready.